but that you, great, thank you so much, Lucas. But as a note, the recording shouldn't include any of the participants, it should just be the panelists. Before we kind of get going, I wanted to just introduce provide some context, introduce this series alongside Open North's work. And if you're not familiar with us, Open North is a nonprofit based out of Montreal, and we work across sectors nationally and globally to foster effective, responsible, and collaborative use of data and technology and solve complex problems. And some of the problems that we think about are how we can regulate new technologies and systems, like how we ensure that our data is protected. But a lot of our other problems are rooted in older systems, such as settler colonialism. And settler colonialism and its impacts are still present today on Turtle Island, and where I am right now, which is situated in Toronto. And Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. And I think just at Open North, we've been thinking a lot about how we can live up to the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. And we've definitely seen there's been a bit more of this effort or attention to it, at least with the remains of thousands of children uncovered at the sites of former residential schools in Canada. And it's horrifying and it's shocking. And I think it's our role as people who live on this land, as folks who are settlers, as also folks who, I came to this country as a refugee, but other folks who have had time to, who either came in ways that we don't particularly think about as settling. It's still, I think, our role and our responsibility to think about how we can support Indigenous nations and communities and people as well. And despite all of these challenges, Indigenous culture and governance systems have remained resilient and continue to flourish today. And when it comes to our work at Open North, I just want to recognize that data has been an instrument of colonialism in Canada, and we want to engage with and learn from approaches such as Indigenous data governance and the OCAP principles, which is ownership, control, access, and possession, which were developed by FNIGC to inform our perspective and our work as well. I'm just going out in the car for about 10 minutes, 15. Sorry, Lucas, do you mind just muting any participants? Thank you. And just at Open North, as we're going through this journey and thinking about this, I also want to take this chance to learn from our partners and folks in the ecosystem as well, and folks who are on this call. So if you have a few minutes, I would love if you can share it in the chat how you or your organization has been supporting or responding to the TRC's Commission's calls to action as well. And for us, at Open North, that means taking in stock not only the risks that data and technology pose for Indigenous communities, such as perpetuating discrimination and surveillance, as well as some of the opportunities, such as using geospatial tools and technologies to spatialize, analyze, and visualize Indigenous knowledge for land and resource management, or using drones to support environmental monitoring, forestry, and stewardship as well. And these are things that we've been trying to learn through our partnership with the Faria group as well. And I'd like you to just take this time to point towards them as an organization that has resources on this, as well as the First Nations Information Governance Center, who had produced the First Nations Data Governance Strategy, which seeks to uphold Indigenous data sovereignty. Again, so I think just these are some of the conversations we're having internally at Open North, and would love to hear some of your thoughts and reflections about this as well. So how does this awareness of inform our work at Open North? As we're finding that smart cities are becoming more popular, we recognize the city stakeholders and decision makers are oftentimes faced with options that are top down or can be privatized or jump to solutions at times. So working with Dr. Tracy Laureate, who's on this call with us today, and Jean-Noé Landry, Rachel Bloom, came up with the first ever definition of the Open Smart City, which is one where all stakeholders, collaborators, mobilize data technologies if and when warranted in ways that are ethical, accountable, and transparent, governing the city as a fair, viable, and livable commons, and balancing the economic development, social progress, and environmental responsibility as well. I think we like to stay away from techno-solutionism. Technology can't solve all of our problems, and it's a tool at our disposal. So I think for us, it's really important to think about what are some of the actual core challenges that communities deal with. Just to share a little bit more about our program, over the last 2 years, we've been operationalizing this open smart city approach to with communities across Canada through the Community Solutions Network, which is a program of Future Cities Canada and is led by Evergreen and Open North as a lead technical partner, and it's funded by the Government of Canada. Our goal is to help communities of all sizes across Canada help explore smart city approaches, and we do this by sharing information, building knowledge and capacity, and creating networks. Open Earth also leads an advisory service that provides access to leading experts to communities, and also provides over 20 free courses in English and French on a lot of these issues. For example, if you're thinking about doing a privacy policy in your community, we have a course on that. Or if you're thinking about how to do resident engagement when it comes to smart city topics, we've got a course for you as well. So lots to do, and I encourage you folks to check that out. And this is a free program. So if you are interested in working with us, please reach out and I will follow up with you. And as a part of the Community Solutions Network program, we invited experts to write about emerging smart city issues. And we published a number of research briefs to date, which you can access them at the Community Solutions portal, and will be shared also in the chat with you. These research briefs are meant to kind of introduce concepts that are emerging and new in the space and provide decision makers with the right type of knowledge to be able to tackle them. Today's research brief was, today's session is based on a research brief written by Olivia Faria. And I'd just like the chance to pass the mic to her and have her introduce the research brief and some of the key takeaways from her research as well.
Thanks so much. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today. Before diving in, I'd like to begin by introducing my background a bit, as well as defining some key terms as well, because we have a fairly diverse audience today, which is so fantastic. So back in 2018, I was a tech policy student, absolutely fascinated by the social implications of the Internet of Things, or IoT. And this refers to a network of internet-connected devices with sensing and analytics capabilities across industries, which is why these things of IoT are often referred to as smart devices. I wrote my honors research essay on the state of IoT governance in Canada, which found there wasn't much action on the subject despite well-documented cybersecurity risks. During grad school, as a communication and data science student a few years later, I began reading about how smart home tech, a subsection of IoT that includes devices like smart speakers, locks, and cameras, were being used as tools of domestic abuse, as we can see on the next slide, such as people being locked in and out of their houses via remote door locks, blasting music and flickering lights at night to intimidate or harass, and remotely changing heating and cooling systems, among others. I was really compelled to research this topic for my thesis as it was relatively new and emerging, and I was curious as to how this problem was manifesting in Canada, especially in the context of controversial but now defunct smart city development, Sidewalk Toronto, Infrastructure Canada's Smart City Challenge, where municipalities could win federal funding for innovative solutions, as well as documented increase in consumer interest and adoption of smart home tech. So while terms are widely debated and there's no standard term for misusing smart home tech for abuse, I personally define this practice as smart home technology facilitated violence, or SH-TFV, for two reasons. So TFV, or technology facilitated violence, is a common term to differentiate actions like cyberbullying, cyberstalking, and revenge porn from non-technological violence by highlighting these new methods and increased controls that technologies can provide abusers. I also added the smart home prefix to draw specific attention to the affordances that smart home devices provide, like remote control of devices in the home to intimidate and harass beyond a phone or a laptop, as well as the ability to cyberstalk via monitoring these devices' activity logs. So today I wanted to share some key themes, findings, takeaways from my thesis and my research brief from Open North. So one of the most important lessons I learned was the benefit of examining this issue using various scales, micro, meso, and macro, which I illustrate on the next slide. So in a nutshell, micro captures devices and dwellers of a home. Meso captures shared dwellings like apartments and smaller organizations out of the home, while macro constitutes large organizations like tech multinationals, federal governments, and ideologies or norms. So typically, an issue like SH-TFV may be viewed on one scale, such as a micro one-on-one dispute, which can provide some insight, but is a very limited way of understanding this issue. Examining all three scales and the relationships between them really start to tell the story, so to speak, of SH-TFV by capturing everything from its enablers, ranging from electricity and infrastructure that power devices to the abusive ideologies that inform the act of violence, as well as the connections to the wider world, including risks and mitigation measures. So things like services for survivors, the policy decisions that make those services available or unavailable based on federal and provincial funding, corporate surveillance, mass data collection and monetization, among many others. So thinking about SH-TFV using this sort of multi-scalar thinking also lets us consider smart cities, which tie in a few different ways here. So if SH-TFV is left unmitigated, it can reproduce across scales and become harder to mitigate as deployment of IoT becomes bigger, more ingrained, or normalized through technological momentum. Smart cities that are developed without these kinds of risks in mind risk allowing new avenues of SH-TFV to flourish, such as landlord-controlled property technology, such as Amazon's Alexa for residential, which allows property managers to install Alexa devices and set interactions like light and appliances, or smart social housing, which is currently being trialed in Peterborough, England via Crosskey Homes and CityFibre. So if we consider how the construction industry is embracing these smart homes, condos, buildings, cities in general, and perhaps this becomes the default in the future, a lot of questions start to arise surrounding power dynamics and individual agency, such as will people, especially marginalized folks, be able to choose whether they're monitored by smart home tech? Will smart homes become a condition of living in social housing? Will opting out of these systems become a premium? As well as jurisdiction and responsibility, such as interoperability between tenant-installed or landlord-installed devices, as well as who's the sort of final arbiter of abuse in these cases. And I find that thinking about bigger scales like this also remind us that this kind of violence doesn't only happen between intimate partners, which can often become the default assumption. I purposely avoided naming SH-TFV with terms such as intimate partner violence, as this kind of abuse can happen regardless of a relationship and may manifest outside of intimate partners, such as between family members, a landlord and tenant, an employer and employee, or even in elder care. There may also be increasing connections between the smart home and city, especially as many of the technology companies such as Alphabet, Google's parent company, and Amazon exist in both of these spaces, leading to a lot of questions about mass data collection and subsequent triangulation, whereby seemingly harmless data, when puzzled together, can provide a scarily complete picture of someone's activities, preferences, and location. Furthermore, in both smart home and city scenarios, data may be collected without someone necessarily knowing or consenting, raising further concerns about multinational companies' ability to monetize this information for their own gain, especially if they have the ability and jurisdiction in the future to combine smart home and city data together, which is why it's so important to begin mitigation measures across these scales before this problem reproduces on meso or macro levels. Thus, I actually find it very helpful to view the smart home as a sort of miniaturized smart city, as not only does it illustrate many of the issues and policy considerations relevant to a smart city on a bit of a smaller scale, like inclusive design, cybersecurity, ownership of devices and data, surveillance, but many of the open smart city principles are applicable to the governance of the smart home as well as mitigation of SH-TFV. Now, All of the open smart city characteristics are applicable in some way, and we can dig in a little deeper during the discussion. But for this introduction, I'd really like to focus on characteristic 2, which is the participatory, collaborative, and responsive nature of a smart city, where sectors have shared rights and responsibility. So like a smart city, SH-TFV requires a multi-stakeholder approach. It's not an issue that can be mitigated by one sole sector or dealt with on a purely individual basis. It is a very complex socio-technical issue that requires extensive collaboration between technology experts and designers, policymakers, frontline service providers, academia, and many more. So mitigation measures like tech abuse clinics, which are the collaboration between tech experts, lawyers, and municipal governments to help survivors and also set best practices for various sectors, policy and legislative action, tech design with SH-TFV as a threat model or incorporated risk, creating building codes for smart buildings, and increasing public awareness and resource dissemination about SH-TFV all require cross-sectoral or multi-stakeholder collaboration and knowledge mobilization, just like an open smart city. So as I say on this slide, this is why I'm so happy to be talking to folks like Suzie and Jasmine and everybody in the chat today, because we all come at this issue from different sectors, scales, lenses, showing what could be possible with this kind of collaboration, especially as there isn't much progress on SH-TFV, especially related to smart cities. As I say on the slide, I would have loved to have this opportunity to talk to folks while writing my thesis to really almost get a survey of each sector's roles and experience on this issue, but there's no time like the present. So I'm really happy to expand on anything during the Q&A session later on, and will now pass it over to my fellow panelists to introduce themselves and their work. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Suzie. Olivia, maybe Suzie, if you can start it off, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak today. I'll quickly introduce myself and talk a little bit about some of the research I've done in this area. So my name is Suzie Dunn. I'm currently an assistant professor at Dalhousie University's Schulich School of Law, where I teach mainly law and technology courses. My research in the academic space focuses broadly on the issue of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. But some of the work I do outside of academia is working with different community organizations to try and create accessible educational material about tech safety and the law. And so I've worked quite closely with the BC Society of Transition Houses, and they have this really fantastic tech safety project for a lot of people who are thinking, like, what are the more practical steps that I have to do to protect myself from these types of privacy invasions? How do I collect digital evidence to prove my legal case? They've got some really great resources there that I think will be shared with the group. And another challenge with doing this research is there's such a lack of data. There's a lack of data, there's a lack of information. So one of the projects I'm working on is with the Center for International Governance Innovation, and we're doing a global survey on people's experiences with tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And I think when it comes to the Internet of Things, it's one of the more novel forms of tech abuse that we're seeing, and there's not a lot of data out there. There's not a lot of research out there. Like there's the great work at the University College of London, UK, with Leonie Tanzer that's really the go-to for all of this. But it's great to see organizations like the one we're working with today starting to create some briefs from a Canadian perspective. I think it'll be quite helpful to have. So I'll be speaking a bit about the legal perspective of things. And I think there's some considerations that we need to think about the way the law is going to be applied to the Internet of Things. And so when it comes to shared houses or shared technology, when we're thinking of things like family separation agreements, one of the things that might need to be considered is whether in those agreements we're including who has access to the IoT, who has control over it, who can block it. And so including those types of things in family separation agreements, I think, is something important to think about in the future. And then also, I think one of the challenges we're going to find in the law is when it comes to things like protection orders, restraining orders, no contact orders, these types of things that can come from intimate partner relationships or abusive landlords or other people. When the courts think about the concept of no communication, I think they're going to have to start incorporating this indirect communication that can come from Internet of Things tracking. If someone is accessing your Fitbit to see where you're going, if they're able to listen in on you using IoT, if they're changing your temperature, like how can that legally be understood as a form of direct contact that might breach some sort of protection order that someone has once they realize either their intimate partner, their landlord, or even these larger smart city controllers have been accessing their content. And I think that there are laws that could be applied to this. I think criminal harassment could clearly be applied to this, voyeurism for when filming is happening. But the types of technologies we can think about that are being misused in multiple ways, like we can look at everything from smart cars. I know Chelsea Colbert, who works at FBF, has had some really interesting commentary on the way that smart cars can be used to track and abuse people. And I really appreciated what Olivia was mentioning about how we shouldn't focus this in as an intimate partner violence risk, though it is one. But thinking about how corporations and smart cities potentially could cause harms as well. And as we've seen in recent reports from Facebook, employees who have access to personal data, who are bad actors, have used this type of data to inappropriately look up people's information or track them or find them. We've seen this happen with companies like Uber. And so what's the corporate responsibility for managing their employees' access to this type of information, or cities' responsibility for accessing who has access to this type of information? And the final point I'll make before I pass it on to Jasmine is that we need to be thinking about these questions at the design stage. When smart cities are being developed, when Internet of Things are being developed, the engineers and folks who are developing this need, in the same way that they think of privacy by design, I think need to start thinking about safety by design and the way that this technology could be misused. And in the way that a lot of nonprofits are doing the work to create safety plans and safety guides about how to manage IoT abuse, I think that's something that a lot of corporations could start taking on themselves, and considering if this technology is being abused, how can we provide direct access, plain language, easy to understand materials, so when people are being abused, they've got someone to call or they got somewhere to go to then learn, how can they block people? How can they change their passwords? How can they get information that shows who's been accessing this technology? And I think that there's some responsibility of corporations that we need to be thinking about as this technology is being developed, so that when people do need to get support, that there's easy, accessible ways for them to do that, including people who are supporting them, like lawyers or victim service workers or transition house workers. And so those are just some of my initial thoughts, and I'll pass it on to Jasmine.
Great. Thank you, Suzie, for sharing some of the legal perspective, some tools that can combat this, as well as what the role of the private sector is in this. I wanted to introduce Jasmine Rezaee next. She's an experienced social policy leader and the director of advocacy and communications at YWCA Toronto. And before joining the organization, she was a frontline shelter and housing worker in Vancouver and Montreal for several years. So Jasmine, do you mind just sharing with us, as someone who's worked on the front line providing services and currently working in an advocacy role, what do you think the role of nonprofits are when it comes to addressing smart home technology facilitated violence? And given your interest and background, are there ways that we can incorporate values of racial justice and equity as well?
Thank you for having me, and those are excellent questions. I think before I offer my response, I just wanted to briefly talk a little bit about our organization. So YWCA Toronto is a multi-service nonprofit in the city of Toronto, and we're a leading provider of feminist and anti-oppressive community programs. I think every year we help approximately 13,000 people and, find safety, gain employment, and access safe and affordable housing. We're actually one of the leading housing providers for women and women-led families. And we offer a range of services to support survivors of gender-based violence specifically. And we engage in systemic advocacy to support gender and racial equality and reduce poverty and gender-based violence in our city and our province. And to the point that Suzie highlighted, I think there's just a lack of data, and there's a lack of understanding, because this is a rapidly emerging and evolving series of technologies. It's hard to almost gauge the level of threat that it presents. One thing that we do know about gender-based violence more generally is that the home is the most dangerous place for a woman. And 38% of women murdered globally are actually killed by a current or a former partner. And here in Canada, on average, every 1 out of 6 days, a woman is also killed, sadly, and usually by either a former or current partner or family member. So one can see how these technologies, these smart technologies, can become really problematic when viewed through the lens of gender and gender-based violence and this kind of foci point of the home, because a lot of these technologies are presupposed on like this happy functioning family, and the truth of the matter is that doesn't describe a lot of homes here in Canada, right? So our technologies are evolving more rapidly than our policies and even our services are. Like, I don't think that the women's sector is in a particularly good place to support such survivors, just because there isn't enough awareness about it, there isn't enough funding for it, and it's hard to almost understand sometimes what some of the rules and etiquette around these types of technologies should be. And I can see it proliferating, as the technology proliferates, becoming an increasing issue in the future. Because at first, the technology was only accessible to a certain segment or class of society. But as the technology proliferates and becomes more ubiquitous all around, it becomes more affordable. It's very easy to download an app. Some of them are free. And so you're going to see it become more and more of an issue across society, all socioeconomic levels, and really with the potential to harm particularly women, because women are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence. So I think we really have to, from where I sit, we really need to do more public awareness and education in the women's sector, in the public, in the government, and in the tech sector, right? And I think, to the point of the previous speakers, I think at the design stage, we have to think about how can we bring in the perspective of women and survivors, and how can we bring in safeguards so that, I don't know, there's some kind of accountability mechanism for this technology. And again, the issue, I think, is compounded by the fact that gender-based violence is often hidden from view, as are these technologies. And our level of literacy and understanding just hasn't caught up to the capabilities out there, right? And there are a lot of tech companies who are making a great amount of money, which is great, but they're not really being held accountable to some of the dual purposes and natures of these technologies. So I think putting in greater supports for survivors and greater funding to address and explore this issue and investigate it is part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Thank you, Jasmine. And I think the first step of that awareness is like opening up the dialogue and having that conversation here as well. And as you three have been talking, I've been making connections in my head, but before I kind of jump into those, I wanted to ask you, was there anything that some of the other speakers had mentioned that stood out to you as something you hadn't considered, or that you had learned, or that you wanted to ask each other first before we dive into some of my other ones?
Are you asking me specifically or the panelists?
I think all three of you.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if there was anything that had either surprised you or shocked you. I think for me, I'm particularly interested because I think like you mentioned, YWCA is also a housing provider. So like how can we think about the impacts of technology when it comes to the services that you folks are providing? So I think that was like an immediate connection made there. But I just want to open the floor for any three of you who wanted to ask each other questions. If not, I can just dive into mine as well. Okay.
I think I'd like to comment on what Jasmine was talking about too when it comes to housing. And I think we've seen this a bit down in the United States too, where there was social housing or lower income housing, where technologies are an obligatory part of accessing the service. And so we saw this with, I think it was facial recognition technology that you needed to use in order to enter the home. And so if we start thinking about the use of, smart city technology being used in social housing, and people are having to choose between privacy and housing, it's a really difficult choice to make. And also if these technologies are embedded in social houses, say if you have a partnership in there and then that partnership falls apart, there's still that risk that this person may have access to the technology. And again, I think what Jasmine said about, the home being one of the most sacred places that we spend our time in, but also being one of the most dangerous places for women to live in with domestic partnership abuse occurring. And I like research by Diana Freed and Karen Levy really speak to this idea about how our concepts of cybersecurity are often focused on larger hacking or government hacking and these types of things. But the cybersecurity issues that come up within families, within friendships, within intimate partner relationships, a lot of the security workarounds that we have are often worked around because you know personal information about that person, like say your security questions. It's like, what's your mother's maiden name? Your partner knows that. And they can get access to that type of information. And so again, thinking back to when companies are designing their security practices and when they're designing and thinking about cybersecurity risks, that risk that comes with people who have intimate knowledge of each other is something that needs to be considered. So those were just 2 points that came up listening to the other speakers.
That is really important. And I think those are things that are really easy to kind of bypass without having either that lived experience, someone who's gone through this, or someone who is in that service delivery role and is knowledgeable about some of those nuances and can inform the design process of these technologies. So I want to go on to the next question. And Olivia, you had mentioned quite a bit in your research brief about the importance of encouraging multi-stakeholder collaboration on this issue. And while there's a bit of a representation here of folks from the legal sector who have experience in that, as well as frontline service delivery, there's a lot of voices that are also missing. I just wanted to ask you, Olivia, if you can start off, if maybe there's any particular stakeholder groups that you think have yet to be engaged or need to take, we need to put a bit more of a concentrated effort to involve them further as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I could go on for hours about this, but just jumping off of our discussion about technology design and technologists, I think they provide and cybersecurity practitioners as well, provide a very pivotal role at mitigating SH-TFV before these devices roll out. So as Suzie was saying, Diana Freed and a couple of those other scholars work primarily in human-computer interaction. And this is a space actually where we're seeing a lot of development being done to kind of stop some of this from happening at a design level. So I believe it was actually one of Diana Freed's articles where they discuss the discipline of user experience and usability folks. Perhaps for some of these devices, it's worth exploring, perhaps not making them as usable, not making them easy, but finding ways to hamper instances of abuse. How can we prevent abuse from potentially happening through smart design? Another really interesting take for that sort of multi-stakeholder engagement is the concept of engaging experts like frontline service providers or even survivors in this design process, taking their lived experience or expertise and incorporating it in at that design level. So it's sort of like the ethos of privacy by design, security by design, but it's really incorporating the real life risks. Because currently I also find, especially in the IoT space, a lot of the security burden is placed on the individual user. Because traditionally, there wasn't really a need for IoT devices to be super secure. It's an ocean sensor, it's an air quality monitor. But now that we have these devices in our homes, our buildings, our cities, collecting intimate information, there's a completely different threat model. And I find right now a lot of the burden to change your passwords, keep up with your security questions, a lot of these cyber hygiene practices, not unfairly, but the burden is definitely skewed towards the user. Whereas I think corporations and technology designers can start sort of equalizing that burden of security, not to mention stronger and more modernized laws, policies. It's a little bit of a, I could go on forever, but yeah, I really like the idea of starting to incorporate these from the ground up at the design level.
And Jasmine, I have a question for you as someone in the GBV sector. Like you had mentioned this is something that's emerging and that the sector may not always be equipped with this. I'm wondering what are ways that we can further engage the sector, equip them with the tools and the resources to be able to support survivors and embed some of these principles in the technology design as well.
Yeah, I think actually having more roundtable discussions kind of like this, or conferences around the issue, or having more workshop sessions about it, producing like actual resources, pamphlets, tangible things that folks can take away, and having these types of conversations internally within organizations too. So now that I'm more aware of this issue, I can bring it back to our organization and have further conversations around this to see what exactly is happening on the front lines, because there are, the communication, I think, is sometimes fractured and siloed too, even within organizations and within sectors. So I think we all sit on different sort of buckets of information, and we need to develop. And in general, our sector is, in some ways kind of fragmented from other sectors, from services are from each other. So I think having a more holistic perspective, taking a sort of cross-jurisdictional or multi-stakeholder approach to this type of issue would be really important. And I think an organization like yours could really facilitate those types of conversations. But yeah, I think having just more information about it, having a dedicated office in the government to examine and release data, collecting data around this. I appreciated how you prefaced the conversation by saying that Canada as a colonial state has had very problematic relationships with many different groups and communities, including in terms of data collection. But it's clear that in this type of arena, we need to figure out a way to create an accountable, transparent way of collecting data that really serves the function of being able to provide policymakers with concerns that are driven by evidence, but also to ask for resources, because it's hard to quantify an issue when we don't really know like how many individuals are impacted. And I think just given the fact that women's safety is just not prioritized in our society at all, and it's just not prioritized in the creation of these technologies, it's concerning, and we can't let the market regulate itself either. And so who's going to regulate the tech companies, right? When most of those women and survivors are not on the development and design and the R&D side. So I think it begs a further conversation. And in the meantime, having any kind of pamphlets or resources or data would be important for our sectors, just so that we can resource share and build capacity around this issue.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the research brief is one place to start, as well as some of the resources that Suzie had shared in the chat as well. And I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to the audience questions, because I'm seeing some really great ones here. But before we do so, I don't know if you, Suzie, if you wanted to add anything to what Olivia and Jasmine had just also shared about engaging stakeholders.
Yeah, I think there's several pieces to that. I think right now we know that that our current government is going to be releasing a technical paper on how to address online harms, potential legislation for that. And one of the things that we've been calling for, particularly through the work that's being done with the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, is calling for a government body where people who are experiencing online harms can go and get support. And I think in order to do that, I think a government body is very important, but I also agree with Jasmine that you need to meet people where they're at as well too. So I think that we need more funding for organizations to learn about these issues, so that when people go get services for whatever community group they're a part of, they can go directly there. But having a larger government funded, secure body that does this research, does this work, and that even those community groups know that they can call this body for information and get assistance on addressing online harms, I think would be extremely beneficial. I'm not sure what the current government's proposals will be around the online harms bill, but I don't think that that's the main focus of what their current proposal is. And I think that they really ought to shift that and really have it be more of a helping organization. And one of the troubles that we find is because engineers are paid so well, it's very difficult to get them to not work for Facebook and to come work for like a feminist nonprofit. It's really hard. But you see organizations like the one in the United States, which is CETA, CETA, it's the Clinic to End Tech Abuse. And they actually have tech experts with them. They work on stalkerware issues. But that's something incredible, that when someone brings a phone and says, I think I've got stalkerware on my phone, there's actual like technical experts who understand this technology. And so I think finding ways to fund and encourage those types of people to work in organizations that are doing this type of work would be very beneficial. But I'll leave it to the audience questions now.
That's interesting as well, because I believe it's either the Clinic to End Tech Abuse or a similar organization. A lot of those organizations receive funding and support from tech multinationals like Facebook and Google. So it's interesting that on the one hand, they are sort of involved in that, but they don't necessarily incorporate those findings or research into their technology. So I think that's another like way to kind of encourage these multinational tech companies. Like, that's great that you're providing money to these, but what are the lessons learned from what the research you're funding? How are you incorporating these findings into your own work?
Thank you, Suzie and Olivia, for that. And just quickly turning to audience questions, I'm going to just start off, Tracy, with your question and move on to Baldwin, yours. Tracy, are you okay with unmuting and just asking your question about the most recent one you had just put in the chat? I can also read it out loud if that's easier. Okay, I'm not seeing Trace, you unmute yourself. So I think I can.
My hands were wet,
okay.
and it caused me a mouse issue. By all means, do whatever you think is most important. Thank you.
Yeah, do you want to ask the question, Tracy, and maybe
Sure.
frame it as well?
So I'll ask the second question, because I haven't really heard an answer to it yet, and I haven't read the whole stream. But who ought to respond to incidences when they do occur? So it's one thing to be able to go to a community-based organization and say, hey, this has happened to me, can you help me deal with it? But then what about the legal issues? What about the enforcement issues? The police, is it the police? Is it the RCMP? Is it the cybercrime unit? Is it internet technology companies? Is it all of the above? It's also interesting to have a kind of advisory board to address and develop policy, but an advisory board can't help you when you have been violated or you are the person that's experiencing violence in real time on an ongoing basis. So my question to the panel is who ought to intervene in these particular kinds of situations, and who has the authority and the capacity to do so? Thank you very much, and sorry for the delay there.
Thank you, Tracy, for your question. I think if it's all right, Suzie, do you mind if I direct that question to you?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. You know, again, I think it's this like classic lawyer answer. I'm like, it depends. Because when it comes to criminalization, I think there's a lot of communities that don't want to engage with the criminal law system. And both with criminal law, family law, and civil law, it's a very slow process. So I think when I think of these incidences, immediately people want help, you know, and so I can see the role of community organizations who are well informed, who have technical knowledge being a very accessible place, because even though Olivia's right, this puts the burden on the victim, but sometimes you need to make those changes very quickly, and sometimes it's simple. Sometimes it is just changing a password, and that's all you have to do. And what the person might want is they just want to block access. They don't want to criminalize their ex-partner. They don't want to, you know, do these things. They want to just get the abuse to stop. And if there's simple technical ways to do it, I think going to community organizations, having call lines with corporations who can help walk people through these process with tech support, I think is the first place to go. And then as things escalate, you know, if you start getting more severe incidences, at that point, people may need or feel the desire to engage with the legal system. And at that point, it depends on what the harm is. It might be a family law matter that's more of a property issue where you have to get an order through the family law courts, or it might be a criminal matter, like if they're filming you while you're changing in your home, or if someone who's like runs these smart companies is like stealing nude photos of people while they're showering or in their home, then that might be a criminal matter that might need to get escalated. Or if it's a level of harassment, like Olivia mentioned in her report, where some people are getting locked in their homes, the heat's turning up, the music's turning up, they can't live their lives. I think at a certain level, there may be some desire for people to engage with the criminal justice system. And at that point, it would be the RCMP who would respond. And again, this is why I think that the nuances of things like no contact orders and other orders that the police or civil law or family law can give need to be specific enough to include contact, including contact through the Internet of Things, and having orders that say, you know, you can't access this person's smartwatch, you can't access their Siri, you can't access these things, and if you do, it will be a breach. And then having the police take these incidences seriously, because what we've seen in other forms of tech facilitated violence, anecdotally, is sometimes people will engage with certain officers who don't understand how problematic tech violence is. So even just getting the issue recognized at the reporting level can sometimes be a challenge. So I think, again, it's a multi-stakeholder approach, but I do think with a lot of tech violence, one of the challenges with the law is that it isn't an immediate response. And often what people need is an immediate response that might be more appropriately dealt with through either tech support from a company, support from a nonprofit, or ideally if we had, you know, a government funded body that had a helpline that people could call for support, I think would be ideal.
Mm-hmm. And Jen, in the chat, I know you mentioned that the need for educating the sector as well, both the legal and other service sectors who provide resources for survivors and those who experience this violence. And there's this need to, and make sure that those folks are equipped with the right resources and language, and so that they can support survivors as well. So very much taken. And then I think we just had another question here from Baldwin about privacy by design. If you're comfortable, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Yeah, I'll read it out loud, Baldwin. So, and I think Olivia, you've started to answer this question as well. Maybe you can be the first person to respond. Baldwin's question is, what a key component of security by design be a limit to the kinds and amounts of data collected in the first place? It seems that currently the thought is that more data is better regardless of need, which opens more paths for abuse. Can we leverage meaningful consequences for data misuse and abuse to incentivize organizations to think deeply about what they collect and how?
Yeah, so this was a really great question. And I just started off with saying that data minimization. So this is I believe it is a principle of privacy by design, where technologies aren't supposed to collect any data they don't need to function properly. Anything that's superfluous or for analytics should not be collected. However, especially in the smart home case, the data collected by these devices is becoming very interesting because increasingly the tech companies are receiving more requests for access to this information from law enforcement because the logs that these smart devices keep, the activity snippets they might keep, voice recordings, these are all actually starting to become used as tools by law enforcement and by the law in general to prove things like developing alibis. And it's unfortunate because using this kind of data as evidence, it's a bit of a slippery slope because while these companies allow you to somewhat control which data you're providing. So for example, smart speakers, you have the ability to mute the microphone so it's not catching voice recordings. You have access to your device history. You can delete stuff. You can schedule deletions. This is becoming a bit problematic when it's being used as evidence. So a lot of these privacy practices, there's like, it's kind of like Jasmine said, where these technologies are dual use, it can be for good or bad. These privacy protections can also kind of be used for good or bad to manipulate these activity logs. So that's a really interesting question. And honestly, I'd love to delve into that more in future work because I don't think I answered this question properly, but it's a fascinating question.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody
For sure.
else would like to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not like we have all the answers, right? I mean, I think when you think of technology or any kind of development, there's a certain amount of ethics at play. And with these dual purpose technologies, again, we can't expect the companies to be regulating themselves. When we think of, for example, nuclear technology, the amount of regulation that goes into that by the government, it makes sense because, you know, you want to restrict certain uses. And I think that similar kind of logic, even if it is flawed in the nuclear sector, it holds to these other technologies as well. And I think the real challenge is when we don't have an office or when we don't have a commissioner in the government or someone that's really examining and looking into the issue, into this problem, the understanding and awareness of it is so nascent that by the time that this technology proliferates and the issues compound, it's almost too late to, I mean, not that you wouldn't be able to change it with policies and stuff, but it's much easier to nip these problems in the bud up front. And the technology is already out there. So I think it's a concerning trend, right? And because ethics, it's really profit that's driving a lot of the motivations. And maybe there is some profit to be made off of women's safety, but there's profit to be made off of selling, you know, technologies that do all kinds of monitoring and so much of gender-based violence is about coercion and control, right? So any tool that can give you greater access to that can be used as a weapon of domestic violence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as you folks have been talking, I've been thinking internally a lot more about what is it that we as individual actors, either as like residents or citizens or either folks who are representative of organizations, what is it that we can do and to take action on this issue? Just so to close off the panel, maybe Suzie, you can start off. Is there one takeaway that the audience should leave with, or like one tangible next step that they can take on this issue?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to this coin, because I think there's the smart cities question, which is, you know, like, do we actually need this technology, and is it actually beneficial to us? And speaking out about whether we think that's true, because I think Jasmine's right. Sometimes the tech is there, and then, you know, you kind of have to like back regulate it. But it's like, do we actually need that data? Do we need that technology? And is it actually helping our society? You know, really asking those questions, I think is the first thing that people can do, and engage in whatever public stakeholder opportunities there are to share your opinion, even if you don't feel like you know a lot about the technology, because these social issues people do understand, even if they don't know the basics of the actual technology. And then from the more individual perspective, thinking of more in kind of the intimate partner violence situation, I think just doing basic tech hygiene, like teaching people how to do basic tech hygiene, knowing how to use your devices, knowing what your passwords are, using password managers, you know, having that be a part of our daily practice, so that we're not doing it once we start facing harms, but we already have two-factor authentication on things. We already know how to look up which IP addresses are accessing our devices or our emails or whatever it is. And just having that general knowledge of good digital hygiene and engaging in that and encouraging other people around it to use things like using Signal, which is a better chatting device. It's a bit more secure than other types of things that might be more easily accessed by an abuser. So I think digital hygiene is just a good practice for all people, regardless of the situation, but in particular when it comes to smart home abuse.
Mm-hmm. And Olivia, maybe I can ask you that same question.
Yep, I totally agree about the tech hygiene. I think we all are capable of incorporating those practices in our daily lives and helping those in our sort of immediate circles with those kinds of issues. But I guess more broadly, I think even just by attending this webinar today, I feel like that is a concrete step. You have taken the time to educate yourself about this new and emerging issue. And I hope that perhaps you learned something new or started considering something that maybe you haven't considered before, because I think this is sort of one of those knowledge mobilization moments where we're taking people from various sectors talking about this issue openly. And I hope that everybody at this webinar today has taken something from it and will incorporate it into their own work, because I know we have people from the private sector here. We have people from the kind of frontline organizations. We have academics here. We all have something we can do. And I think one of those is just participation in these sorts of events, getting the word out, incorporating these sorts of considerations into your own respective work. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. I sincerely appreciate it and hope you've learned something.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Olivia. And Jasmine, did you have any last thoughts you wanted to add?
I've just learned so much, just even by reviewing the brief and considering some of these issues from a more almost theoretical point of view, and then connecting it with my professional and personal experiences working in the sector over the past 10, 15 years. I think it's a really big challenge to tackle, and it's an important one. We're living in a very interconnected and increasingly interconnected world, and that presents some wonderful opportunities, and it compounds a lot of inequities. So we have to be really careful, and it'll be interesting to see. And I'm feeling inspired and grateful, because there are all these really smart thinkers and organizations doing really important work in trying to bring awareness to this issue. So I'm feeling inspired and slightly perturbed.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And I don't know how to leave this conversation not feeling a little perturbed about what's happening as well. So thank you so much, Jasmine, Suzie, and Olivia, for participating in this conversation and contributing to our thinking about smart home technology facilitated violence. I think just really quickly, I want to acknowledge, I believe it was you, Bram, in the chat, who mentioned about what are ways that we can think about how industry alliances are doing in terms of smart home standards and certifications as well. So I think that's also a really good point to think about. And I definitely want to explore that link that you had shared as well. So thank you also for the audience members who participated, asked questions, and attended this event. I hope that it was something that you can take with you and reflect a little bit further on. And as I'm just doing these closing remarks, it would be really great if you could fill out our evaluation survey, which will be launched shortly on your screen right now. It's only 3 questions, just asking you how this webinar was. And I believe there was also a question about if we can share the recording, and we can do that after this event with you. Here, let me relaunch this. Okay. Perfect. I think the evaluation poll should be on your screen right now. And if you have any questions or anything as well, feel free to get in touch with myself or the panelists after this event. Thank you so much for participating. And if you are a community who's interested in figuring out how you could work with Open North in the advisory service, if you're grappling with a lot of these issues, don't hesitate to reach out to me, Jasmine at opennorth.ca. We work with communities all across the country, including Saskatoon, Mississauga, Toronto, both small and large, to help them as they're grappling with how data and technology impacts their communities. Again, thank you so much, and stay tuned for a recording and a follow-up email from us. Great. Thank you so much.